Okay, so let's see if we can use supernature, the thinking, so-called thinking. In Hayek, he says speculation and thinking are the same thing. Um, I presume he doesn't mean by speculation economic speculation, but that's interesting. A forced pun in the English language. His native language was German. So, is thinking the same as speculation, as Hayek says, where speculation is one form of cognition, or is there this Seinfrage around the question of what thinking is? So that thinking is awesomely awesome, or the great wonder of existence, as it were. So let's look at Dugin versus Soros and try to see what's going on in the background by using the darkling plane of Hayek as the connection. So so I'm going to link some Dugin article on the history and development of liberalism into the notes. But the way he sees it is there's development of stages where Hayek is earlier, and then Popper and sort of, I guess like Popper sort of at the same time, but in a way advocating in a way the exact opposite of Hayek from that point of view, and then Soros comes in. So let's try to give the most basic sense of the thrust of what Hayek's saying. So in my opinion, what Hayek's saying is so confusing and chaotic. It's not because really of a flaw in Hayek, but because the subject matter itself is like that. And that's why we're still contesting over it. That's why it's not clear what the right strategy is, but what are the major considerations? So it's one, there's a society of arte, or Cicero said arte is what we translate as virtue, but the problem with that is that the word virtue, when they started translating it that way, meant something more like by virtue of, and it didn't have the moral charge in the same way as it does I think mainly from Victorian England. I mean, the word itself the whole concept of by whatever name you call it, of arte, or what the Greeks were talking about, changed after, say, 500 AD. It started to change because of Christianity. But the word virtue, especially, you could still see in Italian virtù, which is used by Machiavelli, and just saying that, as one of his key terms. And so this means something more like what Hobbes says when he talks about power after power. But what was the original meaning? The original meaning was, and I'm saying all this in order so that we could see what's basically at stake. What's basically at stake is sort of, let's use the notion of exercise. So when Aristotle says that ethics is about habituation, justice is about habituation. There's sort of exercises that we do through fortitude. So Cicero said what the Romans mean here is, by what the Greeks call arte, is fortitudo. But what they mean is, like, when you do exercise, you have to show fortitude because you have to habituate yourself to a certain physical way of being, which corresponds to the best way of being. And so in antiquity, there was no distinction between state and society. It's just the country, as it were, underwent this type of program of exercise, let's call it that way, through schooling, and that was it. There wasn't a division between public and private schools or whatever. I mean, there may have been a totally different education for slaves, but that didn't play that big of a role. So, and then the question Hayek is asking is, to what extent can what he's calling polemically government comes in for Hayek because he distinguishes it from the system of how things are in nature or whatever. He wants to say there's too much of the time we're saying the machine has us down, the man has us down, how do they call it? The system. But and he wants to say instead, let's talk about government, which is the actual policies coming out of Washington D.C. or whatever the capital is, and deal with it and say this is people are acting like there's a omnipotence or there isn't an omnipotence. But then the question is, how much should it release? And does it go so far as to say everybody can do whatever kind of exercise regime that they think is they want, which then leads to all different kinds of people doing different kinds of things. And but here Hayek says there's a choice of, on the one side, something like free spontaneous order in the Adam Smith sense, or an ancient regime brought into the modern techniques and totally determining the exercise regime of every individual. This is where you should show fortitude. This is where you should force yourself. And then there gets to be questions which are basically of the same. And then Hayek says, and you see it in a sort of cruder form in Milton Friedman, I think, is if you allow government to decide these points, it's the same as this question's in a famine situation. It's the same as letting it say, here's where we should intervene in the case of a disaster, but here's where a pauperization, P-A-U-P-E-R, would occur if you, say, give people a large amount of basic income and then they become dependent on that, and then this actually ruins them rather than puts them in the right exercise. But how does the decision get made where, so you see there's some kind of relief is to be expected of government in a tornado, but it's not to be expected in other situations. Then there must be some sort of principle on when to be more prodigious and when to be, or meant to be more profuse, I guess, more profuse with the giving of alms, and when to be more grudging. There must be some bare principle, but on the whole, he thinks everything should be handled by this so-called spontaneous order, which Soros understands in the following way. He says the thing about the spontaneous order for Hayek is it's based on two pillars. It's based on the efficient market hypothesis and on the rational actor hypothesis. And then he says, this is where Soros starts. He says there's Hayek himself, even according to Soros, didn't believe this at the beginning, but he became sort of pragmatically a hardliner on it. But that actually Hayek throughout his whole life had to struggle with that. And so the reason is you say on the one side we adapt the spontaneous order with the efficiency hypothesis and the rational actor hypothesis, but then on the other you admit that there has to be some kind of principles. There have to be some kind of principles that, in the following sense, like you could have a principle that somehow tells you protection of property, let's say, that tells you if there's a bank robbery, depending on the conditions of the society at that point, you may have to give out harsher sentences or lighter sentences. And then a lot of pushback comes from this Hayekian view, because in practice what happens is, if you say there's really harsh sentences for some crimes, like say in California under Pete Davis, I think, we got the 3-strike law, so that there were people for shoplifting or something getting life in prison because it's the third offense. And yeah, so then if you see that there could be a draconian result, well, I guess that's just a matter of prudence. But the real problem comes in say you don't allow the total draconian result, but nonetheless you have some really harsh sentence, but then it disproportionately affects some part of the community. That's where Hayek is basically saying there's nothing you could do about it. That's where it seems like there's a lot of pushback against the spontaneous order, because there's a lot of positions where it's not, the principle isn't doing it, and even the specific laws involved didn't intend to do it, because they just intended to punish crime. They didn't intend to disproportionately affect minorities. And then you get these de facto rather than de jure problems with the kind of the hands-off Hayekian thing, which then some people point to and say, but isn't there, even in Trump's version, a relief for people that get hit with a tornado? Why should there be a relief for them? That's too bad. And we pushed it to the furthest state. It's just, they're just the same as somebody who tripped and had an injury, and then therefore their exercise and their competition of daily life is radically diminished. Too bad. They didn't do the Horatio Alger thing. Fate was against them. So that would be a Calvinist sort of attitude. And so it would be like a what can you do situation, but we don't do that, right? So we do have tornado relief, and we do have some other kinds of extreme relief. So then people say, why not also in these circumstances where somebody is aggregated into a group where they necessarily have to suffer the bad results of being part of that group, even if otherwise they're say before 1948, if you're in the Negro, you would have to be in the Negro League. You couldn't have Jackie Robinson, right? So there's a certain point where that was settled on the basis of saying there must be laws to stop that, but then I guess there's more subtle issues, because there's no there's a sense that it's unjust that somebody being aggregated in a group depreciates their individual effort, or their exercise in that sense of arte or fortitude, their competitive struggle. But on the other hand, there's the question of whether there could actually be a remedy. So you have a sort of nooks down there in that area. But on the whole, what Soros is saying is this whole claim that the spontaneous order must be the best thing is ill-founded, because the theory of efficient market and the theory of the rational actor are not perfect theories. I mean, we know this theory of the rational actor is come under endless pressure, and basically the so-called common sense argument it's based on is just faulty, which is the idea that somebody who has $1, that $1 will be worth more to them than it will be to somebody who has $1 million. That's actually even straightforwardly not true, because there could be very competitive guy, and he's a trillionaire, but he wants that $1 more, and he might want it much more than the guy that has nothing and is basking in the sun and doesn't care. It's not true even on the most basic level. And then to rely on it then leads to a lot of problems. But that's just as an indication of how Soros can say that this Hayek is ill-founded in this sense. But I think Hayek himself is always groping for some new solution, because he came up with this solution of a bicameral government where there'd be something that would always be which would be the equivalent to a constant sort of constitutional convention in a quiet way, and then there'd be a legislative body separate from that to do the pass statutes. But just as now we have the distinction between the Supreme Court and the legislature in Article 1. But yeah, all these considerations aside, I think that Dugin offers against Soros's kind of modification of what was available in Hayek, by which he says, basically what Dugin is accusing him of is what Soros does is he basically takes this double, he makes this Samson move and knocks down the two pillars, and then he says, since we're no longer going by the spontaneous order version, let's bring in the whole open society and plant that here and plant it there, and plant the seeds of it in all the Eastern European countries. And yeah, so that's obvious. It's just what we're seeing in the news today, and we saw it in Moldova most recently, I think.